on behalf of the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress, welcome. Thank you for joining us this morning for a discussion with one of our favorite authors, James Kitfield, about his new book, In the Company of Heroes. A really well done book, really nice piece of journalism. I think a slight departure from what we're used to reading from James in terms of the style, but quite an interesting book with some very well researched and riveting individual stories of 25 Medal of Honor winners from America's longest wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Really an important book. I'm proud to have James with us this morning on Veterans Day Eve, as we reflect as a nation on the service of the men and women who put on our country's uniform and put themselves at great risk for us, for our security, for the good of our country. They really set an amazing example for us. It's the reason why we have a Veterans Day, to reflect on that service. And I think James' book is also well timed to this moment. We reflect on the service of those individuals on Veterans Day, not just as a whole, the entirety of those who have served the country in uniform, but also I think it's important to dig a little deeper, to think about the sacrifices that the families make, to think about what it really means to serve. What does it mean to put yourself at risk on the front line, and what's the work like beyond taking the oath, putting the uniform, and being ready to deploy? What's it really like once these folks get out in the field? I think the book, James, gives us an opportunity to celebrate the personal traits of some of these individuals, the heroism, the decision making they have to make under fire, the dedication to their units and their teams and their fellow soldiers. It gives us an opportunity to understand a little bit more about what it means to do this level of service. The book, it's a really good resource for us. It's not meant to be read straight through. There's no novel arc, but it's 25 individual stories that you can pick up, choose, read one, put it down, take a break, which, as we were discussing, is oftentimes the best way to read a book like this. The stories are gritty and often harrowing. There's a reason why these folks earned the Medal of Honor, and it is difficult to sometimes to keep moving through it rapidly. You want to take it in segments, but the stories really are quite compelling, and I appreciate the fact that you took the time to put these together. I want to ask you, James. Let's start by tell the story of how you decided to write a book like this, and how did it come together?
Okay, thanks for doing this, Glenn. So I covered these wars for going on 20 years, for mostly as a senior national security correspondent for National Journal magazine, and I have embedded myself with units in both Afghanistan and Iraq, but basically was reporting at the strategic level, because we were a policy magazine.
Right.
So I would sort of shadow senior leaders to try to figure out whether their plans were working, what was happening. But I was always just totally in awe of these young volunteers on the front lines, who basically they were the most people who were most impacted by these strategic decisions. And if you spend a lot of time in a war zone with our all-volunteer military, it's hard not to walk away being very, very impressed by these young Americans. Never really had a chance to tell that story for National Journal, so I always was looking for a way into telling their stories, how things looked at the front lines, how they looked, as you said, at the sort of the gritty tip of the spear. And I had an opportunity when a couple of years ago, the Department of the Navy reached out to me and offered an exclusive interview with the most recent Medal of Honor recipient. At that time was a Navy SEAL named Britt Slavinsky. Funny enough, I had actually done a story for Air Force magazine before that of someone else who was highly decorated for their actions in the same battle on his team. And I found his story so Homeric. I mean, as you said, all of the fog of war it was entailed. This was the first time that Al Qaeda and the Taliban had really stood their ground and fought in the Operation Anaconda. There was a screw up that put them, on the top of a mountain where they really would rather not been. They wanted to insert themselves, lower down the mountain and sneak up to their overwatch position, which is how the SEALs work. But because of that, they got put on top of the mountain, got helicopters ambushed. They barely make it out of the ambush site, crash land. But they realized they'd let that one of their Navy SEAL comrades had fallen out in the ambush zone. So then they, after crash landing, getting picked up and taken back to base, this young SEAL has to make this incredibly difficult decision. A Predator drone suggests that their SEAL comrade is still alive, but he is surrounded by Al Qaeda fighters. And they also know that going back up and trying to get him is all but a suicide mission because they're outnumbered. Their approach will now be expected. They'll be fighting uphill through snowdrifts in the dark. All these reasons, and this Navy SEAL was a Eagle Scout. He said the thing that kept going over his mind was the Eagle Scout pledge about I pledge my honor to do my best to do my duty, and that helped him make the decision to go back up. And not one person in his 5-person team questioned that decision, even knowing that they were probably a death sentence for all of them. And they went back up and got him. And indeed, there was a lot of tragedy awaiting at the top of that mountain. But it was just amazing to me with the kinds of responsibility and decisions. I call it a brush with eternity. These people could have done the safer and with honor could have done the safer, the more tactically defensible thing, but instead they do the hard thing because they have this creed: I'm never going to leave, a fellow soldier or SEAL or comrade behind. And he lived up to that at the cost of some of his teammates' lives and almost his own. And that story just really inspired me to want to tell more of these stories because it gave me a chance to really reflect on what these wars look like from the very tip of the spear. And as you mentioned, this is some of the most intense combat any generation of American soldiers and Marines and sailors have faced. And so I wanted to tell that story, especially as the wars were clearly winding down in recent years. I thought it would be an important coda because, I think the public has kind of turned its back or its attention away from these wars a long time ago. And I wanted to remind them that what these volunteers have the kind of service they've provided for the whole country.
You mentioned this was a little bit of a change in some of your earlier approach. You mentioned some of the work for National Journal. I should mention James is a decorated journalist in the sphere of national security, including a 3-time Gerald Ford Award winner and many other prestigious awards for writing about national security. You've also published a lot of great interviews with generals and, as someone who's been embedded, has obviously been exposed to folks up and down the chain of command from the very bottom to the very top and reflected quite often on some of the lessons for policymakers. Some of the things that we at CSPC would take up in our normal day-to-day routine of looking at how presidents and their teams and Congress make high-level decisions about policy, and what we can learn from that policy process and how it plays out in the field. But this one was different in the sense that you focused on individual incidents and individual people. Tell us about the process. You mentioned one particular story that motivated you to look deeper. How did you go about collecting the 25 individual stories of the Medal of Honor winners from recent years?
So I wanted to write about every Medal of Honor recipient from the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan because that was my framing reference. I had covered these wars, so I knew the context of these engagements. I have written at great length over the last 20 years about the all-volunteer force and how it carried this burden really on its own shoulders. It's only 1% of the public have really borne the weight of these conflicts, these volunteers. So, after I had that initial interview, I just reached out to all 25 and said, I'd like to write a book. Totally, engrossed by your actions. And some of them cooperated, and I did interviews with them. Some of them would rather not, and I certainly respected that, because as what the remark made to me a number of times was, I don't really like talking about this, because this is a weighty burden, this medal. It's a great honor, but at the same time, it reminds me of the worst day of my life.
Yeah.
A day I lost friends, a day I experienced the horrors of intense combat, and they just really would rather not talk about it. And that's certainly something I respect. But there is a lot of information out there. When they receive the Medal of Honor, they do media interviews. That kind of goes with the territory. A number of them have written books. Some of them quite big bestsellers, like Lone Survivor, which was made into a movie. So there was a lot of information out there. So it allowed me to sort of piece together, do some research. I did some Freedom of Information Act request to get at as much detail as I could. But quite honestly, there is a lot of information out on these individuals, because Medal of Honor is a very big thing. The services use them to basically publicize the best amongst them, the people who basically live the creed of selfless service, selfless sacrifice, going above and beyond the call of duty. So it's important. These are very important individuals, and there's a lot out there that helped me. Another thing that I felt was very helpful was a number of the Gold Star families, because a number of these recipients received it posthumously. They were killed during the action, which is described in the Medal of Honor. And so I talked in a number of cases with their families, and it reminded me that a lot of the courage reflected in these pages of these books, it happens far away from a battlefield. Whether it's a Gold Star family trying to piece together their lives after losing a cherished loved one, or whether it's a grievously wounded Medal of Honor recipient. In one case, Kyle Carpenter went through 40 surgeries to piece his body back together. And just excruciating rehabilitation. Same with Flo Groberg, who tackled Carpenter jumped on a grenade. Flo Groberg tackled a suicide bomber to block the blast from his colleagues. He went through horrible rehabilitation, and yet both of them, used the experience that could have broken many people, but used the experience to somehow rekindle the warrior spirit they had, and use it as a positive inflection point in their lives. And I found that incredibly courageous. So there's a lot of courage in this book that's reflected, that happens away from the battlefield.
What did you learn about the nature of the Medal of Honor, the process, and the significance of the awarding? You mentioned something about the sort of conflict in some ways between recognizing a service person's heroism in a way that they didn't ask for, and amplifying it and talking about it and asking them to relive it in such a way that causes sometimes some personal discomfort. And yet there must be some value to the nation to talk about these things and understand and reflect, so that we can understand better what goes into this kind of service. What did you come away with as an impression of the Medal of Honor process itself?
Well, I mean, I found it to be, as you would expect in the military, very meticulous and very disciplined process, because, as I said, these are very big deals. And so just to really highlight one individual's actions above what is stories of multiple units' valor is a big deal for them to sort of elevate that one person. And in the instance I talked about, Britt Slavinsky, the Navy SEAL, just a quick scenario. They go back up the mountain to get their friend. again, get ambushed as soon as the helicopter sets down. They end up fighting, multiple machine gun nests, trying to go uphill in snow drifts. Um, the Air Force combat controller, who's a part of the team, gets shot, presumed dead. They can't find Neil Roberts. Another of the SEALs gets badly wounded in the leg, ends up losing that leg. They have to retreat down the mountain. They find out that later, because of a drone, picks up that the Air Force combat controller, John Chapman, wasn't killed. He ends up awakening and fighting on by himself for 20 minutes until he runs almost out of ammunition. Quick reaction force comes up, helicopter comes up. He exposes himself to try to give cover for the helicopter, mortally wounded. And then the helicopter gets shot down and they lose some of the quick reaction force. So it was just this, it was obvious to me that those two individuals were extraordinary. But the comment made to me by Britt Slavinsky was, if you look at everyone's actions that day, from the pilots who got ambushed and crash landed and flew us back up, to my whole team, to the quick reaction force that came up there to help us, not because they knew who we were, but because they knew we were in trouble. Everyone deserved the Medal of Honor that day who fought in that battle. And, I kind of agreed with that. It was like everyone made incredibly courageous decisions to put their lives at risk or forfeit to save each other that day. And so, finding individuals from a group who are very individually, showed a lot of valor is difficult. So how the military does it is it goes up the chain of command. Someone in the immediate commander recommends this person for the Medal of Honor. It then goes to a decorations board. If his chain of command agrees, the decoration board will investigate first, and talk to everyone in the battle, try to reconstruct exactly what happened. It can take like 18 months to 2 years for that process to play out. Then eventually it has to be signed off by the service secretary, the civilian secretary, the chief of staff of the service, the highest military person in that service, and the Secretary of Defense. And if he agrees, that it is sent over to the president has the final decision. So it's a very meticulous process, which is typical of the military. They don't take these things lightly, and they know that in some cases, something I've learned well before this book is that no two people experience a battle exactly the same and agree exactly what happens. It's such an intense environment that you see it from a very personal perspective. So they know they'll be second guessed, and so they want to get their ducks in a row. So they do a lot of investigation to try to get it right.
Yeah, I noticed some of the stories that you wrote. There was some commentary from the winners that they would only accept if they could accept essentially on behalf of all the unit or all the people that were involved in that moment. What were some of the other themes that connected the stories? Because they're 25 individual stories, and there is quite a bit of difference in exactly what happens in the incident where the recipients earn the Medal of Honor. What were some of the other kind of common themes that you felt threaded the stories together?
Well, I mean, the most obvious common theme, and I've gone back and looked at all of these narratives, and the most common theme is each of these individuals had a moment. I called it a brush with eternity, a moment when they knew their lives could be forfeit, and they could have probably done the same thing and saved their lives and still honorably served, because these are instances of as the wording of the medal says, above and beyond the call of duty. And each of these individuals at that moment decided that putting their life forfeit was more important to them if they could save their comrade in arms lives. And that runs through each of these stories. And a number of them have people jumping on grenades, or again tackling a suicide bomber. There's a young Green Beret, Robbie Miller, who was walking point on a unit at night in the Hindu Kush, in the forest, in the snow. They get ambushed. His captain gets badly wounded, and the call goes out, retreat, let's get out of this ambush zone. But they're getting cut down as they try to get out of the ambush zone. So this young Green Beret, instead of retreating, goes forward into the face of this ambush and fires and fights on alone for like 15 minutes, to give his comrades a chance to get out of that kill zone, and gives up his life doing that. And time and again, it's stories like that where they have this decision point where they really put their own lives at forfeit. I think there's 7 where they literally to the point of just jumping on a grenade. But also, I mean, all these stories are like Fritz Levinsky and his team going back up on the mountain, knowing they're likely to die, trying to get their comrade out. There's an Army Ranger who was fighting ISIS, and they was on a hostage rescue mission. ISIS had 80 Kurdish hostages they were going to execute, and they were already digging the mass graves. And they get onto the prison complex. One of their rangers is immediately shot and killed, almost coming out of the helicopter. And the prison building catches fire during the firefight. Machine guns being firing from within the complex, and he runs into that burning building not once, twice, but 3 times to try to break the lock to let the hostages out. And once he gets the hostages, the lock broken, he personally, guards their exit from that building with his own life because he had body armor on. And it's just story after story like that, where, it's just amazing that they have this value system where the call of duty hits, and they are willing to sacrifice their own life to save others. And that to me is kind of the ennobling, inspiring thing about these stories, is even though they're, as you said, usually tragic and really harrowing, there is inspiration that we are still producing people like these who, when confronted with that choice, do as one father told me about his son who died falling on a grenade, lived honorably and did the honorable thing when he was faced with that hardest of all choices.
Yeah, I mean, they're pretty amazing individual stories. You're somebody who has deep expertise in the lessons learned from our interventions in Iraq and Afghanistan. How much did that kind of lesson emanate from these stories? How much were you learning or connecting to in some kind of resonant way, ideas you'd already started to form about the lessons from these conflicts? How much of that will come out of the reading of this text?
I purposely try to tell these stories in a way that doesn't talk a lot about lessons learned from Iraq and Afghanistan, because you quickly get into policy and lessons learned.
Mm-hmm.
The first lesson that comes out of these stories is, if you commit these people to war, you're committing them to a horrible, horrible experience. And we should, even though we have the strongest military in the world, when you see the experiences of these people, you come to understand how sober that decision has to be to start a war, to engage in a war, to continue a war. And that comes through very clearly. So I think that's one important lesson we can get from their stories, is know what you're putting people through, know what you're assigning them to do, because it's really, really the toughest thing you can ask a human being to do, really. And that's an important lesson. Another thing that I think, and I mentioned in the book that, credit it to the volunteers who fought these wars, which are a lot of the senior leaders who as David Petraeus says in the back of the book, in an early review, had the privilege to lead these individuals, these volunteers, consider them the new greatest American generation. And I think that's right. I mean, this is the first time the all-volunteer U.S. military has had an extended period of conflict. The only other conflict involving our all-volunteer military was the Persian Gulf War in 1991, in which they performed superbly, but it got over in a matter of days. This time, it was 20 years. And having covered the all-volunteer force and how it was created in my first book, Prodigal Soldiers, I knew from great research and talking to some of the people who actually created it, that the architects of the all-volunteer military never intended or would have imagined that the country would send it away to fight wars for 20 years without calling up reinforcements through the draft. That was just assumed in the creation of the all volunteer force, that it was a placeholder force until you could reinforce it with a draft.
Mm-hmm.
And when the country decided not to do that, it had a lot of repercussions on the all volunteer force. One of the things that I'm most admirable in a lot of these stories is a lot of these individuals, I would say the majority, joined after 9/11.
Mm-hmm.
So they knew they were going to be going into combat. They volunteered knowing they're going to be going to war, which I thought was pretty amazing commentary about the value system we still have in our young people. But because that we didn't call the draft, these individuals had to go back to back to back to back combat deployments. And, the psychiatrists have already shown that every time you go back into combat on a subsequent deployment, not only is it extremely stressful on your family, as you can imagine, but it increases your likelihood that you'll suffer post-traumatic stress issues. And anyone who's seen what these people go through, and again, the book helps you understand that if you're going back and back and back into this kind of combat, it's incredibly hard. And it's so there was an epidemic of divorce at the height of these wars because the family strains. There was a lot of post-traumatic stress as there is in any war, but this, especially in an extended war like this, from volunteers. There, and as one general told me, he's not sure that we would have fought for 20 years if we had had a draft where you were drafting the sons and daughters of the middle class. And that's exactly why the all volunteer force was formed in 1973, is because Richard Nixon was tired of all the anti-war protests. So his answer was to just make it a volunteer military, that way they can't complain. And it worked. There were no anti-war protests in these wars, even though they dragged on a lot longer than the public support for them lasted. And I think that's something we have to come to grips with too as a country. You're going to get involved in conflicts like this, which insurgencies are typically a decade or more of a conflict.
Right.
Then you should think very hard about what you're asking of an all volunteer force. Now, having said that, the military would never want to go back to a draft either, because it has found a high-tech military that has very complex machinery and technology. A professional force of volunteers is far more competent than a draft army where you're recycling through people, many who don't want to be there every year. So there are certainly, the military would never want to go back to a draft army, but we have lost something when we gave up the idea that our wars, the burden of our wars should be spread amongst all able-bodied citizens. It's not just small one percenters. So there's a lot to be contemplated about the kinds of things. But again, I don't get into a whole lot of policy argument in these books, because I just want to tell these people's stories. They all have soapboxes. They can talk about their opinions about the lessons learned from these conflicts. I didn't want to drag them into that, which can get to be a pretty partisan fight pretty quickly.
Sure.
And, so I didn't get a lot into that, but it's on the fringes of these stories.
Right. I think that's a really important point. You tell the Medal of Honor stories, but there are a lot of folks who don't ever receive a Medal of Honor. There are plenty of folks in uniform who actually don't even see this level of combat, but still deploy for years, and the strain on their lives is significant. And that story is a big part of what service means as well. I want to offer the opportunity to our the audience that's with us here live to post questions for James. If anybody wants to submit a question, please use the Q&A function and just submit your question, and I'll weave them into the conversation as we go forward. But let me ask you, James, in the meantime, so you went and did a range of interviews with either recipients or families for those who are posthumous. Were there any surprises for you in the collection process for all those stories?
I was surprised until I got into it. I mean, I kind of naively thought that these individuals are so extraordinary and honored that they'd want to tell the story of this worst day in their life. And as I got into it, I realized that that's not the case, and I understood why. So that was kind of a surprise. And I think um, I was surprised about thinking they were going to be stories of courage under fire and bravery and valor on the battlefield. And there's a lot of that, obviously. But I was surprised that there's a lot of these stories are about tenderness and love, which kind of surprised me. But if you think about it, a person who's willing to jump on a grenade and sacrifice their lives to save their friends, there's a lot of love in that action. And that runs through it. There's a story of Salvador Gunta. His unit is ambushed on a ridgeline high in the Hindu Kush at night. Um, Everyone taking a lot of casualties. They barely fight out of it, and they get to one of the casualties, and they said they took them, and he quickly realizes that the Taliban, who had been hunting for a trophy, i.e., captured an American soldier, so they could parade him in front of the videos and probably cut his head off. Had captured one of his buddies and were dragging him away. And he jumped up without thought of it, ran right into the place where the enemy had ambushed them, and sprints ahead and comes out of a clearing. And sure enough, there's two Taliban fighters dragging his best friend away. He runs him down, kills both of the Taliban fighters, and made sure his buddy's last hours on Earth were with his friends. And they all gather around him, waiting for a medevac, but he succumbs to his wounds before that. But you could hear the team describing how important it was that he, last minutes of his life were with friends who were trying to reassure him, as opposed to being with the enemy. And that was an act of extreme tenderness to me, and that runs through the book. I mean, Bert Slawinski and his team going back up to try to rescue Neil Roberts, who was the SEAL who fell out of the helicopter, was an act of extreme love. And Robbie Miller, I mentioned the Green Beret, charged into the ambush, and just story after story like that. So that was kind of a surprise at how much these were stories of tenderness and love versus, just G.I. Joe valor type. That's not it. It's something far deeper and more profound than that.
Did you find that your impression was there was some uniqueness to these individuals that was sort of detectable prior to the act? In other words, did you talk to friends, family, fellows who said, "Oh, this was not a surprise to us. We always kind of knew this person was going to be this type of soldier," or was it more surprising in that it was just the normality of a service person who, under a certain set of circumstances, just acted in a way that was, as you said before, above and beyond, but kind of in a way represents the potential that's there in almost any service person. Where on that scale did you find that came out?
It's an interesting question, Glenn, and it is a scale. And I will say that the overriding impression I had was these were ordinary people who, when confronted with extraordinary circumstances, act extraordinarily. Mm-hmm. But I mean, there were some common threads. Most of them were athletes in high school. There's a lot of athletes, who had been on a football team or had been on a baseball team or had been a gymnast in Robbie Miller's case. But that seems to be not all of them. That seems to be a thread. These were athletic people who understood team and liked being part of something bigger than themselves in terms of teams. They came from all corners of the country. That was almost a surprise, because there's kind of a assumption that the South and the Mountain West tend to be overrepresented in the military, and that shows in the fact there's many of the big bases we have are there. But actually, these individuals came from big cities like New York and the Mountain West, the Northwest. It came from all over, and I found that encouraging, that we have communities all over this country who are producing young men and women with these values of selfless service of being part of something bigger than themselves. I found that somehow encouraging because they did come from all over. They tended not to be, and I have noted this in my earlier reporting. They tend not to be the sons and daughters of hedge fund managers and uh, Hollywood movie stars. They tend to be uh, middle class, working class, sons of working class. A lot of them are sons of their fathers served in the military. So in that sense, the military is almost like a family business in a lot of these cases. And so they're inculcated into sort of military, wanting to serve in the military by watching their parents. That's very common. And I've known that from earlier reporting too. So just sort of like I said, sons and daughters of teachers and workers and military people, but not so much of the upper elite classes. And that's because of the all volunteer force as self-selected. That's the people it attracts the most, and that's been noted before. And it's interesting though. You see the values that Middle America is still instilling in its children, and it gives you some hope for this country.
Participant asked if you can contrast at all the 25 award winners that you wrote about with past Medal of Honor winners from previous wars, Vietnam, Korea, World War II, etc. Were there, as far as you can tell, any distinctions or particular differences in either the process or the awardees themselves based on the era or conflict?
Actually, I think there's more of a common thread than a contrast there. To be honest with you, I studied some of the previous, and I've gone to a Medal of Honor Society annual function where they bring them all together from all the wars of the living ones. And I think it was when I finished writing the book, there were 72 living Medal of Honor recipients. And really, what you find is that common thread of ordinary people who did extraordinary things when confronted with extraordinary dangers. The thing that distinguished this force is that it's an all volunteer force. But what you find when you look at a lot of the stories of Medal of Honor recipients from World War II, when we had a draft army, or Korea likewise, or Vietnam likewise, were the types of people who lied, when they were 16-year-olds and lied to be able to join the military, like Audie Murphy did in World War II. And so these were people who probably even in a period of a draft army would have volunteered before they got drafted. They're that kind of people typically. But no, I think you get a room full of them, and they all seem of a type, in a very admirable type of solid citizens who you could count on to watch your back, no matter what kind of foxhole you were in and what kind of war you were in.
I got a question from a Marine, David Anderson, who was asking if you could talk about the fact that there were only 25 Medal of Honor winners over the last 20 years of conflict versus more than 250 in Vietnam. What are your opinions about the process? And did any of the subjects recommend others who thought that should have been received recognition beyond the ones in the immediate vicinity of that incident described? What is your reflection on the volume difference between different conflicts? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I think there was a bias against of this generation of senior officers who have to sign off on these, that for whatever reasons, that they were a little bit more parsimonious with Medal of Honors than I think personally was called for. And that might be because they came up post-Vietnam, and maybe they thought that there was too many given out in Vietnam, and it's hard to know what's in the hearts of people. But the interesting thing is that when General Jim Mattis became Secretary of Defense, he noticed this very same thing. And of course, he was a 4-star general, served in combat in Iraq and Afghanistan, a legendary wartime leader. And he felt that himself, that they had they had been too stingy, given the valor that had been exhibited by these. So he had the services go back and relook at the Distinguished Service Cross, which is the second highest award, and Silver Stars, to see if maybe they deserve to be upgraded, and that happened in a number of cases. That definitely happened, and I think when you read these stories, I don't think there's many people who read these stories who have any doubt that these people are these recipients should have received the Medal of Honor, and so I credit General Mattis for that, for sort of opening the eyes and saying, why are we being so stingy? These
Yeah.
are really remarkable stories, and they deserve this recognition.
How does that process begin? Is it typically immediately post incident? Someone who's there or a commanding officer it recognizes on the spot, wow, that was extraordinary what happened there? Or is it something that over time, with reflection, just becomes clearly something extraordinary?
More the first. There, in most cases, although there are some exemptions, you have it's a 2-year period. So within 2 years of the actual event or the battle, you have that window to recommend someone for the Medal of Honor, and then it goes up to the next chain of command and see if it's a battalion, then it goes up to brigade command, then it goes up to division command, and if it clears, the first initial chain of command, who all think it should go, but then it gets assigned to a decorations board that does the investigation, and after that, the decision is made to elevate it up to the top of the chain of command, which is the service chiefs, the civilian secretaries of the services, and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and ultimately the Secretary of Defense. But I think one of the reasons why maybe they were stingy in some of these cases was, so if a battle goes badly, and that's certainly the case in the battles of Roberts Ridge and Brest-Litovsk. If the battle goes badly, I think there's a hesitancy to award a Medal of Honor, even though it might be richly deserved, because it's part of a battle that went really badly, and some of that happened in that battle because the Air Force thought that John Chapman deserved the Medal of Honor when it came out from the drone video feed that he had awoken and fought bravely for another 20 minutes. The Navy SEALs were very, very hesitant to come to grips with the apparent fact that they had left John Chapman on top of the mountain thinking he was dead. Of course, and Brest-Litovsk says, he was sure he was dead. He crawled over to him, took his pulse to the degree you could. He was dead. The thought was, well, he might have crawled over Neil Roberts, who they went up to save, who eventually was executed by Al Qaeda, because it was at night, confusion, being shot at, bodies everywhere. So anyway, it's the process has been reviewed a number of times, and like I said, I credit General Mattis, Secretary Mattis, for having people take a second look. And when they take a second look, I mean, all you have to do is go down to the next hierarchy of medals and say, well, what that person did, could that have qualified for Medal of Honor if now that we have a little bit of a space to think about what they did. And as I said, in a number of cases, they indeed did sort of upgrade the medal from the Distinguished Service Cross to a Medal of Honor.
I was struck by the story of Staff Sergeant David Belavia. It's the chapter that you titled "House of Broken Mirrors," and I wanted to ask a couple questions and get your thoughts on that story. But
sure,
I'm wondering if you might, for the benefit of the viewer, just thumbnail describe that incident and kind of what about his actions were extraordinary.
Sure. So that was in 2004, late 2004, the Battle of Fallujah. So it was the inflection point in the war because earlier in the year, the Marines had been ordered to take Fallujah away from Al Qaeda and the insurgents. There was an uprising long story short, they were pulled back, and so Fallujah became the sort of stomping grounds of Al Qaeda in Iraq and their ilk. And the military understood this, and by the end of 2004, ordered the military to basically take Fallujah. And so most of the civilian population leaves, and what's left are hardcore Al Qaeda in Iraq and related insurgents. Some of the worst urban fighting since the Tet Offensive in 1968 in Vietnam and the Battle for Hue or Hue. House to house combat, the worst kind of combat you can have. Think of the last 20 minutes of Saving Private Ryan, and it gives you a pretty good idea of what it's like. David Balavia's unit goes into a house. Usually they fire into the house with a Bradley fighting vehicle with high explosive round to clear it, and then they go in there and clear the house. But they couldn't do that because there was concerns about the round could go right through that house and hurt some other Americans in the neighborhood. So they go into this house and they're ambushed by two machine guns. And they're pinned down, and people are shouting, "We're going to die in here. We can't get back out." And they're pinned down by the machine guns in really close quarters, bullets coming through walls. And David Balavia stands up, and he has a machine gun, and he suppresses the machine gun nest of Al Qaeda long enough for his group to get out of the house, and he then retreats out when he fires his last bullet. And remarkable already. But at that point, talk about decision points. They're taking fire from rooftops in the neighborhood, and he had seen stacked rocket-propelled grenades in that house, knowing that that's a danger to their formation. So he almost single-handedly decides to go back in the house and finish the mission of clearing the house. And he and one other person who's basically in his rear, watching his rear, go back into that house, and he ends up in this horrific fight. Kills 3 insurgents. The house has been hit around by this point, so there's sewage all around. The mirrors on the walls have been broken, so they're crazy angles. He can see insurgents in other rooms, and he's trying to get a beat on them. Fights, kills 3 insurgents, goes up to the top floor, thinks the house is cleared, puts his gun down, smokes a cigarette, and another insurgent drops down from the floor above, and they get into a hand-to-hand combat, and he has to use his knife to neutralize that insurgent. So it's like I said, kind of think the last 20 minutes of Saving Private Ryan is that kind of urban warfare that he did, and no one could really explain why he decided to go back in almost alone to finish the mission, except for he said he was pissed off that they had retreated in the face of the enemy, and he wasn't going to do that. So, I mean, that's the kind of people who are in this book. Right. It's really remarkable, the things that, when confronted by that kind of extraordinary situation, what these people will do. And Glenn, something else I should say about when we talk about the all-volunteer force, when we have an all-volunteer force and don't have everyone sharing the burdens of a war together, you lose something as a country. And I think there's a comment I want to read from David Balavia. It gets to the point of why we're so partisanly divided now.
Yeah.
Because we look at ourselves as the enemy now. And let me read you his quote. David Balavia said, "There's a million plus reasons why Americans are divided right now. And throughout our history, we've always disagreed and dissented. But we always found a way to put our differences aside and focus on what's best for the nation when it counted most." And then he goes on and say, "Well, we don't care in the Army if your dad died and left you $1 million or not. I personally never cared what God a soldier worshipped, what color they are, or who they loved. If someone is willing to get shot at for me and my buddy, I will lead or follow you anywhere." That captures something about these stories. These people, all these partisan divisions in the country, they don't care about that. They are a team that will give their lives for each other. And they can be Democrats or Republicans or gay or black or white or whatever. They don't care. And I think what I hope comes through in this book is that we've lost some of that because we don't have a draft. And if we're not going to have a draft, we ought to figure out ways to recapture it, because it's a really important thing that these soldiers are trying to tell us is that, we're all Americans. And when you're in a situation like this, that comes through very strongly, that you are American, you're American, and that means you're on the same team. And I feel like we've forgotten a bit about that. And I think these guys can help, and women who serve in uniform can help teach us and help us relearn what it is to be on the same team.
I marked that passage as well, and I plan to raise it today. So I'm glad you beat me to it. I thought it was extraordinary, and it really kind of reflected on the moment for me too. Especially how he goes on to end the quote by saying, "At the end of the day, I believe our country is worthy of that kind of sacrifice." Is that the message of this book?
I think so. I mean, I think so. These individuals certainly think our country is worthy of that kind of sacrifice. And who are we, when confronted with their remarkable examples, to say otherwise? I mean, with this, these are deeply patriotic people. They come from, as I said, every corner of America. So it's not, there's no divide between city and country, and uh, you know, suburbs and exurbs and rural. There's these divides don't mean anything to these people, and I think um, they understand. And I credit our senior military leadership talks a lot about this a lot. That, they're confounded by a lot of what's gone on in the last few years in terms of our partisan rancor, and they've tried very hard to keep the military out of that
Right.
drum, because they realize there are still communities all around this country creating and nurturing patriots like these, and that's to be celebrated. And it's not to be, you're not. It's not to be pointing like, my part of the country is better than your part of the country, or my city background is better than your country background. It's that we are, as a country, creating in every kind of community people with these kinds of values, and we should celebrate that and understand how important that is.
Yeah, I think just I think you might want to turn your speaker down a little, James. I can hear a little feedback, but I just wanted to say in the last few minutes that we have, um, just wanted to reflect on that thought that you raised and about what it means. I was impressed with the stories you put together about how, as you mentioned, oftentimes the stories about an individual who gets in a very difficult situation and when offered an opportunity to end the situation chooses not to end it for some compelling reason, chooses to go back into the house, chooses to go back up the hill, chooses to go back after a buddy, to fly back into a contested zone, a hot landing zone, because they lost somebody on the ground there. It's also a story of people who often chose to go back into service when they had an opportunity to finish their service. In other words, they've been through a lot. They had an opportunity to go home and decided that the fight was still on and they wanted to stay engaged in it and see it to the end. There were several stories like that. In fact, even Staff Sergeant Belavia, who went back as an embedded reporter after he'd finished his military service and went right back into the field. And you think to some extent, like maybe that's what's extraordinary about many of these folks is they declined opportunities to get themselves safe and decided to keep at it, as long as the mission was there. And I think perhaps that's the most extraordinary part. But I have thought that one of the interesting reflections is, it may be a revelation, is that their dedication to country is something that is actually normal. In other words, it's present in most of us. Say substantially all of us have some devotion to our country as a common thing. But we are also human beings who get distracted by political party teams and news media and social media and these things that swirl around us, pull us in different directions and accentuate our divisions. But at the end of the day, when given the right opportunities, we will find a way to focus on what brings us together. Unfortunately, for many of these folks, what it takes to bring them to that, or at least for us to see it, it is very hard such personal situation in the middle of dangerous and bloody conflict. But I do think if we can reflect the lesson on ourselves a little bit and change our behavior as Americans, just bend that behavior a little bit back towards that unifying curve, that thing that makes us American, that devotion to our country, and a willingness to see each other as Americans first, and then all those other things after that. There's hope, right? And I feel like that's one of the things that kind of shines out at the end of this book. It's a hard read in some ways. As we mentioned at the outset, the stories are difficult. They are, um, there's brutal situations, and you're left with a sense of awe and respect for the individuals that receive the medals. But you're also left with a feeling that there's something more here. And I really appreciate you taking the time to tell those stories because I think they're important. I understand the theme and the challenge of asking folks to relive this, but there must be a greater point to doing all this. How did you feel at the end of the project in terms of how you thought the book might land on the reader?
So you made an interesting point about those who returned to the fight, and it reminded me of two in particular. One was Sergeant Leroy Petrie, who, again, previously wounded through both legs. He's in a firefight. A grenade lands at his feet. Him and his buddies. He grabs the grenade and tries to throw it away. Blows off his hand, and he continues to organize the fight and successfully. And he even with a prosthetic hand went back to Afghanistan and served another tour, which was amazing to me. Navy SEAL Chief Edward Byers, he was on a hostage rescue mission for an American doctor who was captured by the Taliban. He was the second person entering the target house where the hostage was being held. First person through, his friend and SEAL team member shot dead. Yet he still runs through the door, neutralizes 3 insurgents inside, and successfully, rescues the hostage. After his ceremony at the White House, where he received the Medal of Honor, he went back to be a Navy SEAL, went back into the battle for years. So that's a perfect example of what you're talking about. If I could, I'm just going to read a quick note because it reminds me of what you were talking about. That General David Petraeus, who most people know, gave me a really nice early review. And he said, the book is an enthralling reminder that even in the toughest of times in the post 9/11 wars, the extraordinary men and women in uniform who fought America's longest wars never backed down from the enemy, never quit on the mission, and most important, always remain true to each other. This important book describes why those of us privileged to lead our men and women in combat truly consider them America's new greatest generation. I think that gets to your point. It's that these people show you what it's like to never give up on the mission and never give up on each other. And that's got to be an important lesson for us now, given just the place we find ourselves in the body politic.
Well, I just want to say how much I appreciate you spending the time with us to talk about In the Company of Heroes and the effort you put into writing it. I'm glad you were inspired by that first story, which was really quite a harrowing story. I think it's either the first or a very early story in the book. The first one about Brett Slabinski and the folks that were fighting alongside him that day. And glad that you decided to take on the project of telling the other 24 Medal of Honor stories. I think it's an important book, and I hope that folks will take the opportunity to get it. And again, just read it from time to time, I think is the best way to do it. Like, keep it nearby, and when you feel like you need some inspiration, it's a good place to go. I think, again, as we're approaching Veterans Day, it gives us an opportunity to study the actual incidents and heroism of individuals, but also to reflect on something bigger. And so I want to just say thanks, James, for taking the time and effort to put these stories together. And again, let me just show the book, In the Company of Heroes. Really nice product by James Kitfield. Thank you, James, for being with us.
Glenn, and I want to thank you too. The years I've been a senior fellow at the center have allowed me to do. Your support has allowed me to do things like this, and so I thank the center for all you've done for me, and just really proud to be part of your team.
Well, thank you. I'm proud to be associated with this project. Thank you all for joining us today, and be well and be safe. A happy and reflective Veterans Day to you all. And we'll talk to you soon. Thanks again, James. Take care.